You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. Over the last couple of years since Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7th and Israel's ongoing attacks on Gaza in response, college campuses have been spotlighted as a major battleground where ideological and physical conflicts have played out. Protests erupted across the nation on the issue, and leaders at some universities have cracked down on the demonstrations. Longtime college administrator Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum argues that campuses are the exact places where these sorts of conflicts ought to be hashed out. Dr. Tatum is a psychologist who has spent over 40 years in higher education. She was the president of Spelman College for 13 years and was most recently interim president at Mount Holyoke College. She applies that philosophy, the idea that colleges are the places to engage in these often divisive topics, to other social and political issues. In her new book, Peril and Promise, she suggests that those issues are among many facing colleges today and calls upon leaders of these institutions to appropriately address them. Here's my conversation with her. All right, let's go back to your time as dean and vice president of student affairs. At that time, you had a new opportunity in cultivating an inclusive community for students. And it starts with these foundational principles, the ABCs,
Yes.
as you call them. Yeah. They stand for affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership. Can you break down where those principles came from and what they mean?
So when I became a dean, I had been a professor for 17 years, going on 18. And during my time as a professor, one of the things that I'd learned is how important it is for students to see themselves in the classroom. Not just in terms of, who's standing in front of the classroom, but what text are we using? What books are we reading? What films am I showing? People want to see their own experience reflected. And as a psychologist, I'd been studying the experiences of Black youth in predominantly white settings. When I became a dean, I told my staff that our goal, working together, would be to affirm the identities of all of our students, to build community where everyone felt connected and part of a larger whole, and to cultivate the leadership of this next generation of students who would need to know how to engage effectively with people different from themselves in order to be successful as leaders in the 21st century. I sometimes use the analogy, and I write about this in my book, about the analogy of a photograph, a group photograph. If you and I were in a room together with 100 other people and someone took a picture of all of us standing together at some public event, when we got our copy of the photo, the first thing each of us would do would be to look for ourselves in the picture. And if for some reason you weren't in the picture, maybe you got cropped out off the edge or digitally removed, to some reason you're not in the picture, you would wonder what's wrong with that picture. But if it happened to you over and over again, you might start to wonder not what's wrong with the picture, but what's wrong with me? Why is it that I'm always left out of the photo? Somehow I'm not being included. And when we think about colleges and universities, it's kind of like stepping into a group photograph. We all want to see ourselves included in that picture. And not just included, but included and looking good, right? We want to be, smiling, our eyes open, our clothes right, all of that. We want to feel like we are positively being represented in this organization. And when we feel that way, we're more likely to stay, to persist to graduation, to want to continue to support the institution after we leave. All of those positive outcomes are connected to feeling a sense of affirmation.
How was that received? How did that framework work out for the institution at that time?
It was very well received. I knew the faculty, they knew me, and I had a lot of experience with the students at Mount Holyoke College. As a professor, I had gotten to know the campus community quite well. So I think people appreciated the emphasis on really trying to create an environment where everyone felt like they belonged. Sometimes when we talk about a sense of belonging, people think, oh, you mean the Black students or the LGBTQ students or the Asian students, that there's some group that doesn't belong that you're trying to help. But in fact, affirming identity is really recognizing that everyone wants to see themselves reflected positively in the environment. We all, as human beings, want to feel seen, heard, and understood. So we have to think about, in an intentional way, how leaders should be thinking about, in an intentional way, how do we create an environment where everyone will see themselves?
The ABCs, those certainly sound similar to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that have been a hot button issue as of late. Is that an accurate characterization?
They overlap, but they're not synonymous. One of the unfortunate things about the term diversity in particular is that it has been used as a shorthand to refer to groups that have historically been marginalized. I've had the experience of being asked on a survey to list the percentage of diverse participants. Let's say there's 100 people. What's the percentage of diverse participants? The question implies that some people are diverse and some people aren't, right? But of course, everyone is diverse. Everyone has contributed. The only right answer to that question would be 100%. What percentage of the population was diverse? 100%, because everyone contributes to our diversity. But if there's 100 people and one Black person in the room, you would not say the room was 1% diverse, right? Because everyone contributes to that diversity. And I think I think that when many people hear the term diversity, they assume that it's the people of color you're talking about, or the LGBTQ people you're talking about, or the women in a male-dominated environment that you're talking about. And the people on the other side of that equation feel like they're being left out. So if we have a program that is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, some people will say, well, what about the white people? Well, white people are included in diversity. White people are included in equity. White people are included in inclusion, but they don't experience it that way. And I think part of the fault of that is how we use the language, the inappropriate use of the language. Sometimes when people are hesitant to talk about race, or even to talk about, I've experienced working with folks who are hesitant to refer to Black people as Black people or African American. And so instead they'll say the diverse students in the room, right? The word diverse gets used as kind of a shorthand to describe what we have sometimes referred to as racial minorities. And if you're talking about it in that limited way, a lot of people are left out. But when you talk about affirming identity, you're talking about affirming everyone's identity, not just some people's. So I think that's the difference, as I like to think about it.
And so it's primarily more about the language or the word diversity. It's a messaging issue. So when people hear DEI, they're thinking about a certain group of people.
Yeah, in this moment, in this anti-DEI moment, I would not say it's just about messaging, right? I think there are people who are not happy with the changing demographics of the United States. There are people who are not happy with the racial progress that has been made over the course of my lifetime. So I don't want to suggest that I'm saying, oh, it's just a matter of semantics. It's not. Let's talk about it in this way. If you're the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, there were a lot of those before the language got attacked, right? If you're the chief officer, the chief diversity officer, if you're the director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a lot of your programming will be focused probably on the groups that are less well represented on your campus. You are working with students who feel themselves marginalized or maybe less well represented. Maybe you're doing special programming for first-gen students, first-generation college students. People will not look at that office and say, this office is for everybody. And I think those programs are important and necessary. I'm not trying to suggest that they aren't important or necessary. I'm simply saying that when you are asking the question, are we affirming everyone? You're asking the question, who's missing from this picture? Maybe the picture is leaving out young white men. Maybe the picture is leaving out, the Muslim students on campus. And if you get in the habit of asking, who's missing from your picture? It's not just this particular group or that particular group. You're thinking about the whole and making sure that everyone feels a sense of belonging.
You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Carrie Jr. II. I'm speaking with Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum. She's a psychologist who spent over 40 years in higher education. She was most recently interim president of Mount Holyoke, and we're talking about some of the hot button issues in higher education today. So, Dr. Tatum, when it comes to college campuses, a lot of the conflict today has to do with ideologies as well.
Mm-hmm.
From your perspective, do you feel universities provide an equal opportunity for students to engage in dialogue on a range of political issues that may be uncomfortable for students?
One of the things I talk about a lot in my book is the importance of dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that institutions provide enough opportunity for dialogue to take place because people assume that it will just happen, right? You know, if you invite 100 people into a room and leave them alone, maybe they'll have conversations about the tough topics. My prediction is they won't unless you create a structure for that, unless you invite people into that conversation and say, you know, here's a tough topic that's going on in our society. We want to talk about it on our campus so that we can all be informed about it. We are going to do it in this way so that multiple perspectives can be heard. Not everybody's going to agree, but we are practicing learning through our dialogue activities how to listen carefully to people whose points of view are different from ourselves, how to respectfully disagree when we do disagree, how to do that in a way that allows us to remain engaged. And it might take more than one conversation. One of the things about colleges and universities, I think it's a really underutilized capacity, is that we have time and space to engage with one another.
Now, I want to ask about the responsibility that could be placed on colleges even outside of the classroom. Because when I think of campus, I do think the classroom is one place where professors have a lot of control over the dialogue, and therefore your example, I think, reigns true. But even when it comes to facilitating this type of interaction on campus outside of the classroom, does the university have a responsibility to do that? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what it looks like because I did some of that when I was dean. So when I became dean at Mount Holyoke, one of the reasons I agreed to take the job was because I was very interested in creating a dialogue program. And we didn't do it as a class. We did create a class on intergroup dialogue so students could learn about it, but a lot of what the activity was involved students outside the classroom who were interested in taking on leadership roles. For example, a common leadership role on a college campus is being a resident advisor in the dorm. One of the things I did in my role as dean was to encourage students who wanted to apply for those leadership roles to learn some skills about dialogue to strengthen their qualifications. So the student who wants to take on that role might, in fact, take an intergroup dialogue course because I know this is going to help me as an RA, or when I get in that role as a resident advisor, one of the things that's very common is that I need to do some educational programming on my hall. Maybe one of the things I want to do is to create a dialogue group on the hall, and we're all going to talk about choose your topic. There are lots of examples around the country of institutions, Mount Holyoke being one of them, but not, the University of Michigan there in Ann Arbor is often thought of as the home of intergroup dialogue, where the literature and the research around the impact of intergroup dialogue has really been honed. And outside of the classroom, students themselves are learning how to be facilitators.
There is a conversation around people who are engaging with folks who say things that someone might find offensive. The phrase hate speech comes to mind, of course. It's been used a lot in recent years to condemn remarks from primarily conservative speakers they find offensive. I guess my question for you is, how do you handle that as a president who is trying to facilitate this dialogue between people from different ideological backgrounds.
Well, what I think you're speaking about is free speech,
Yes.
right? There are limits to free speech, and I want to acknowledge that you don't get to get in somebody's face and call them names. That is not free speech. That's harassment. You don't get to harass people, but you can articulate a point of view that I might find offensive, and you still have a right to do it if we are honoring the principle of free speech. And I get to say what I want to say, and you might not like it, but I still have a right to do it, right? Free speech is really an important principle, I think, on a college campus. And I do know that one of the things that has really emerged in this younger generation of students in an age of social media is some appreciation or desire for speech to be controlled, right? If you spend a lot of your time on social media and you see people using offensive language um, and feel hurt by that, you want some protection from it. And that may be understandable. At the same time, it has been the right to free speech that has led to some of the racial and social progress that we see today. You know, the protests during the civil rights era were protected by the principle of free speech. So you can't have it both ways. If you want to protect the principle of free speech, you have to be willing to allow people to say things you don't like. That said, a common response, in my view, and an effective response in the case of offensive free speech is not to try to quell it, but to have more speech. You know, it's rather than trying to silence this person's opinion, create the opportunity for more speech. What are the other points of view? What are the other opinions that might counter that speech I find offensive? And I think many college campuses try to do that. However, we all culturally, we're living in a moment where the phrase cancel culture, right? People talk a lot about cancel culture. Oh, she said that, cancel her, right? And so I really appreciate a phrase that Professor Loretta Ross has coined, which is not that we want to cancel people, we want to call them in. You know, if I've said something that you find offensive, you know, don't blast me on social media. Reach out to me and give me feedback so I can learn from that. Or at least we can have a conversation.
I mean, that also underscores your initial point about discomfort. There are two different perspectives on this issue, and one person feels uncomfortable or offended by what that language is. You have to engage in the discomfort of pulling that person aside and engaging with them on a further dialogue to get to the other side of the issue. Coming up, we will continue my conversation with Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum. Stay right there. We'll be right back on the Metro. You're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Carrie Jr. II. Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum is a psychologist who has spent over 40 years in higher education. She was the president of Spelman College for 13 years, and she was most recently interim president at Mount Holyoke College. In her new book, Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times, she suggests that many universities need to create spaces where the social and political conflicts we face today can be hashed out. Let's get back to my conversation with her. Let's dive into the protests that arose on campus as a result of the Israel-Hamas war. The conflict has escalated into a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and it sparked protests on college campuses across the country. Universities in some cases have responded by cracking down on protesters, and that's raised questions about free speech and how much free speech protesters or college students have on campus. Now, I understand every university is different and every protest is different, but as a president, what considerations do presidents take into account that you believe is being left out of the broader dialogue about how college campuses and college administrations have been responding to this situation?
student protest is not new, right? We know, I mean, in this moment, particularly in the academic year 2023, 2024, there was so much protest happening, highly visible on the nightly news, Columbia being sort of the ground zero for the involvement of police and destruction of property eventually, and, lots of things associated with that protest. But we also know that there were protests during my college years around the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, protests around apartheid in South Africa, lots of protests. Students protest about lots of things. And so in a general way, I'd like to say in a general way, I think it's important to recognize that too is part of academic freedom and free speech. But we also need to set some parameters, right? And most campuses do have parameters around where can you protest? How can you protest? Can you disrupt people going to class? You cannot, so that there's time and space limitations. That said, if I, as a leader, am trying to understand what the protest is about, I have to use my dialogue skills, right? I have to listen carefully to students, find out what is the concern. Sometimes you won't know unless you listen carefully to what students are saying. What really is driving this protest? What really is the concern that is at the top of student minds, so to speak? And, often a protest comes with demands of one kind or another. Well, I know, and many leaders know, that in conversation, sometimes you can say yes to something. You can't always say yes. There's some requests, some demands that just are non-starters. But if I can listen carefully and see where is there common ground, where is there a place where we can have some agreement, that's a good place to start our conversation. And if I listen carefully and find myself in an impasse with students as the president or as the senior leader, one thing that I can do that might be helpful is to engage faculty in the conversation as well. And the reason I say that is because who do students know best on the campus? Their professors, their advisors, the people who are working with them on their thesis, or, their research assistants to them. That faculty member who has known them all semester and understands what is most important to them, their advisor who understands what's important to them, might be a person who can help bridge the gap between the administration and the students. And I think if you look at places where conflicts had been resolved on campus, often there have been faculty leaders who have played an important role in that. And then the third thing that I think is really important is to, if at all possible, avoid engaging law enforcement. Because that just escalates the conflict. If there are students who are protesting and you invite police into the equation, there will be other students who join the protest, not even because they agree with the protesting students, but because they don't want that protest to become a criminal activity. They want it to be what it is recognized to be, an example of free speech in action or academic freedom. That doesn't mean you allow students to destroy property or hurt other people or harass other people. And I think we can point to examples where that happened and that needed to be interrupted. But before the situation gets to that, if you're listening carefully and engaging key stakeholders, I think you can sometimes come to a better place and a shared understanding of how to move forward together.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. I'm speaking with Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum, who spent over 40 years in higher education. She was most recently an interim president for Mount Holyoke College. She spent 13 years as president of Spelman College, and we're talking about the state of higher education and universities from the president's perspective. All right, Dr. Tatum, You mentioned in your book that you're not a fan of issuing statements on like the news of the day if it's not directly related to the institution's core mission. Can you just explain to me how you
Yes.
came to that conclusion? And I guess maybe elaborate a little bit on it as well.
Sure. Well, when I was, I'm gonna, you know, give
Sure.
an example. So when I came to Mount Holyoke in the fall of 2022 as the interim president, I knew I was going to be there for 1 year. It was a community I was familiar with because I had been there earlier in my career, and some of the same people were still working there. But at the beginning of that semester, there was a big flood in Pakistan. A lot of flooding, historic flooding. Two-thirds of the country was underwater. And a faculty member with family ties to Pakistan sent me a message and said, "Are you going to comment on these floods?" It hadn't occurred to me, to be honest, that I should send out an email commenting. But I realized that at Mount Holyoke, there was a significant number of students who came from that part of the world. School had just opened. And of course, they would be worried about what was going on at home and their families. And so I sent a message of that kind saying, we are aware that these floods are taking place. Some of our students have just arrived. They have concerns, offering what support we could offer, whether that was through the counseling center or, whatever we could do to assist students who might be upset or struggling or need support given the particular circumstance. It made sense to me to do that because it impacted our community or a portion of our community very directly. Another example, shooting at Michigan State, you know, um, horrible gun violence, a number of, I think, 8 or 9 people killed in that instance, and the whole community terrorized, of course. And anytime that kind of shooting takes place, everyone else is wondering, could this happen on my campus? How could, anxiety about that. So I spoke about that. But there are other things that are going on in the world that are upsetting, but don't necessarily impact our community directly. Wildfires in Australia as a result of climate change. Should I comment on that? I'm not a climate change expert. It's not directly impacting our community. We don't have students from Australia. We're all impacted by climate change. There's something happening in the news every single day that's horrible that a person could comment on. But if I comment on this one and don't comment on that one, then you get criticism like, Dr. Tatum, you commented on that instance of climate change, but you didn't comment on this instance of climate change. I got a lot of other things I have to do as president, right? Daily commentary on what's in the news today is not at the top of that list. And so I decided that there was just too many. So unless it was directly relevant to our campus community, I was going to spend my time on other things.
I do wonder, like, it feels like it opens up, though, an unfortunate can of worms where if it is international conflict and there are
Good.
folks who are from that region on your campus, does it
Yes.
matter how many students there are on the campus before you say that there's enough to say this is an impact to then address it?
I think you have to decide on a case by case basis,
Hmm.
right? And let me just say, the president is not the only person who can talk about something, right? So if there is a conflict in some part of the world, and we have an expert on our campus who studies that part of the world, we want to lift up the voice of that expert, right? I will be happy to speak about the things that I'm expert about or that directly impact my areas of responsibility. People talk about the Calvin principles, right? Professor Calvin was a professor during the Vietnam era, and there was a lot of protest during that time, as we know. And the president, whoever was president of the University of Chicago at that time, put together a faculty committee that was chaired by Professor Calvin and asked them to study, like, should we comment on the civil rights debates? Should we comment on the Vietnam War? And what the committee wrote in their findings, they thought about it. They wrote what we call the Calvin Doctrine. And what they said was the university should take a principle of neutrality, right? The university should be neutral on these social questions, or the president at least should be neutral, not because the president isn't entitled to a point of view, but if there's a conversation that's happening where some people feel one way on the campus, some faculty members feel one way, and other campus members feel another way. And if the president, because the power of the president is such that if the president has a strong point of view, the president expressing that strong point of view is likely to silence the other people.
And it doesn't foster a dialogue as much
Yes.
on campus. It says one is right, one is wrong. That's the end of the discussion.
Exactly. So you're in this powerful position, and it's like you're putting a thumb on the scale, right? So because of the authority that comes with that position. And so let's say I'm a junior faculty member and not tenured, but I have a strong point of view and it's different from the president's. Do I feel like I can express my point of view? Will it negatively influence my tenure case when I come up for promotion? Those are the kinds of concerns that the Calvin Commission talked about. So they said institutional neutrality. That doesn't mean that the history professor who knows a lot about the civil rights era can't express that point of view, can't go on NPR, can't talk about, their knowledge. But the president necessarily might want to allow the faculty, the scholars, the people who are most knowledgeable to be the ones speaking up about those things. However, I think it is also important to say that the Calvin Commission also said there are times that are so critical to the life of the institution that the institution must speak up. And I think we are living in such a time as this, because the attack on higher education is so broad and so focused and so detrimental. I think it's incumbent upon institutional leaders to speak up.
The book is titled Peril and Promise, and although we've outlined a number of topics of contention in higher education right now, I do want to give you whatever time we have left to outline the broader concerns you feel universities are facing.
When government leaders insist that institutions conform to a particular set of cultural norms, whether that is attempting to dictate what will be taught and what won't, or what speech will be allowed and what won't, who should be invited into our community and who shouldn't. And they use their control of much needed resources, whether that's federal research grants, federal financial aid dollars, visas for tuition paying international students, as the lever to force compliance. The very existence of the institution is threatened. That's a serious problem. So how can we respond to that? It is very difficult for one individual campus leader to say, I'm standing up to this. Harvard has said, we'll stand up to it, but they also have the largest endowment in anyone's history, right? Billions and billions of dollars to back them up, to pay legal fees, etc. I think what should happen is that graduates of these institutions, alums of which there are thousands and thousands of people across the country, have benefited from the transformational nature of higher education. And those folks need to raise their hands and say, this is not what we want our federal government to be doing. This is not what we want our state governments to be doing. We know that education is transformational, but it cannot be hamstrung in the ways that we see the federal government attempting to do if we want to continue to have the best system of higher education in the world, which the United States has had for many years. Don't screw it up.
That was Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum. She's a psychologist and a former university president. She was speaking on the current state of higher education in America. That's going to do it for the Metro today. The show is hosted by Robin Vincent and Tia Graham. It's produced by Sam Corey, myself, Carrie Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender. The music is made by Sam Bobian, and our senior producer is David Lyons. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.